I'm James Ty. Thank you all for coming again. Really glad to see a great crowd coming out this morning to learn more about our lakes. We have a pretty special place in here in Madison. Madison Lakes sort of define our community. Wanted to bring you up to date on some of the things that Clean Lakes Alliance has been working on since our last meeting 30 days ago. The most important one is the update of the Yahara Clean plan for our lakes. So Yahara Clean is a great acronym. So C stands for capital, L stands for lakes, E stands for assessment, environmental assessment and B, so EAN, compact. So the compact was originally signed, the first version, back in 2008 by the Secretary of the DNR, DADCAP, the county executive, and the mayor. It laid out 74 actions to work on phosphorus and E. coli for the lakes. It was completed in September 2010. At that point, the Clean Lakes Alliance was founded, and we took that, along with those same partners and ourselves, brought in the UW, Dick Lathrop is in the room, and sort of got to the next stage where we decided that we needed to reduce phosphorus by 50%, and we had 14 actions to do that. And we then started working on those actions. We are now at about 33% reduction towards our goal, and things have changed. We have a couple of invasive species in our lakes. Climate change is real. We had a flood last year. We also had a large rain event in February of 2018. And the Clean Lakes Alliance, through our strategic plan called Plan 2020, realized that we really needed to update the plan. So we now have a letter of intent signed by even a bigger group of people to work together to look at what are the issues and the challenges for lakes and how we're going to solve them. And that has now been signed by the new Secretary of the DNR, the new Secretary of DADCAP, the County Executive, the Mayor, Madison Metropolitan Sewer District, the Department of Limnology, the Dean of the Nelson Institute, the Dean of UW Extension, and we're going to be inviting others to join this effort. It will probably take about 12 to 18 months, but when we come out of it, we're going to have a clear path forward to help protect our lakes now and into the future. So look for some stuff coming out in that here shortly, but really thank you to all of you because you support this organization through your financial donation, by coming here today and learning about the issues, so then you can go out and tell your neighbors and friends, whether they like it or not, all the good science information that you learned today. We're very grateful of our sponsors, First Weber and Johnson Bank, and also our supporting sponsor, National Guardian Life. And here today to talk about National Guardian Life and why the importance of lakes are important to them is Sarah, and I welcome Sarah to the stage.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Clean Lakes Alliance, Clean Lakes, Yahara Lakes 101 at the Science Cafe. Thank you, I want to reiterate, James, thank you for coming in, especially on this kind of dreary Wednesday. Glad to see you all here. My name is Sarah Galani. I'm from National Guardian Life Insurance Company. I am also a proud graduate of the Yahara Watershed Academy as of yesterday. Along with the presenting sponsors, First Weber Foundation, Johnson Financial Group, hosting sponsor, Edgewater, University of Wisconsin, Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, and media partner, the Isthmus National Guardian Life Insurance Company is absolutely proud to be a supporting member of the Yahara Lakes 101 Lake Science Cafe. Just a few quick announcements. First, we want to thank the businesses and organizations that became lake partners in the month of May. Lake partners make donations outside of tickets, sponsorships, or events. If your company hasn't signed up to be a 2019 lake partner, please see the Clean Lakes Alliance staff member at the end of the meeting. Second, Clean Lakes Alliance Loop the Lake bike ride is this Saturday. The ride starts at Old Bridge Park and is $35 per rider, and kids 10 under are free. All riders will receive a super soft shirt. I've seen them, they're really nice. Snacks and drinks along the way, and a picnic lunch with a beer or soft drink at the end. There's still time to register. Info is on cleanlakesalliance.org. You can also sign up the day of at Old Bridge Park starting at 9 a.m. And back to Yahara Lakes 101. Today we're going to be discussing Lake Mendota phosphorus. Phosphorus, of course, is a naturally occurring element that fuels those large cyanobacteria, or blue-green algae blooms that close our lakes and beaches, which is no fun on a nice summer day. And just 1 pound of phosphorus can fuel growth up to 500 pounds of algae. Here to tell us a little more about the talk and introduce today's speaker is Clean Fuels Partner, Vice President and Chief Administration Officer, Jessica Lucas.
Good morning. Oh boy, a microphone and a captive audience. This is awesome. Clean Fuel Partners is a proud sponsor of the Clean Lakes Alliance, and we are thrilled to be the sponsor for this month's Yahara Lakes 101. A little bit about Clean Fuel Partners. I know some of you know what we do, but we own the Dane County Community Digester just outside of Wanakee. We process manure for 2,500 cows off 3 dairy farms, which equals about 90,000 gallons daily. We add a little bit of substrate to that to increase the methane, and then that is turned into electricity. We take the byproducts of that and ship those outside the watershed to help protect the lakes. So speaking of the lakes, today's topic is Lake Mendota phosphorus and our water quality woes. And as a digester owner, this is something that's near and dear to our hearts. We strive to keep phosphorus out of the lakes so that we can enjoy those throughout the summer. It's a topic we're really passionate about. So today, Dr. Paul Hanson from the UW Center for Limnology will dive into the dynamics of Lake Mendota to help us better understand the links between human decision-making and water quality. Dr. Hanson is a distinguished professor of research at the Center of Limnology, studying lakes and reservoirs as ecosystems embedded in human, landscape, and climate contexts. His work is focused on issues of water quality and how lakes and their services respond to nutrient and carbon inputs from the watershed. Dr. Hanson's research has been applied to lakes and reservoirs around the world through his leadership in the Global Lake Ecological Observation Network, which is a mouthful. Awesome. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Hanson.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Great. Thanks for that nice introduction, Jessica. Thanks to the Clean Lakes Alliance, especially James and Paul and the rest of the CLA folks for inviting me here. And thanks to all of you for showing up on this cold and dreary morning. It's great to have a live microphone and a captive audience. And I'll admit it's slightly terrifying, especially, I know Dick Lathrop is in the audience here somewhere. Dick, where are you? Dick, raise your hand. There he is, right? So Dick and I came to the Center for Limnology about the same time in 1992, although he had been involved with limnology prior to that for a while. I was hired from the Boeing company to come and do computing work at the Center for Limnology, and Dick was coming in to work on his PhD. We started our PhDs at roughly the same time. Dick focusing a lot on Lake Mendota and the Yahara Watershed, focusing on phosphorus quite a lot. So Dick is known as Mr. Mendota, and he knows a lot of phosphorus. So Dick, this is the first time I've ever given you a lecture about phosphorus in Lake Mendota. So this is like a star in my career here. And as Dick said earlier today, I hope I learned something, and maybe the computers can teach us something too. So I bring computing to the table. I work that in. Technology is a big part of my PhD work and has continued to be a big part of what I do today. So we're going to talk about Lake Mendota and phosphorus. But first, a couple of quick words about the Center for Limnology. Maybe many of you have seen it or have been there and had a chance to visit the CFL. Dick and I both did our PhDs here with Steve Carpenter. The Center for Limnology has 2 facilities, the Hassler Laboratory on Lake Mendota and Trout Lake Station up in northern Wisconsin. The Hassler Lab was named after Art Hassler, who was a professor there starting in about the 1930s. The building didn't exist in the 1930s. The center was built in the 60s and the department was formed in the 1980s. But this traditional limnology started way back in the late 1800s with Virgin today, and they handed it off to Art Hassler, who subsequently handed it off to John Magnuson, who hired me, and Dick and I both know John very well. And there have been a few directors since. You probably are a little bit familiar with that. What I think is fascinating about the history of the Center for Limnology is the history of phosphorus and land use change is about coincident, with the history of phosphorus in the Yahara Watershed. I also want to mention here, too, that the work that I'm going to talk about today is sponsored by the National Science Foundation that has funded this grant up behind it. It's called CNH, Coupled Natural Human Systems. And it's a project in which we brought economists together with land use change folks and hydrologists and then limnologists to understand how economic decisions that happen in the watershed make their way into land use decisions and ultimately into nutrient loads and water quality changes. We're sort of on the tail end of this project and right now putting the different pieces together. But one of the initial steps that we wanted to do was to look at changes in water quality in Lake Mendota based on information we already have and try to then piece that together with the economic decisions and land use change that result in changes in hydrology and nutrient loads to the system. In this project, we also are partnering with the Clean Lakes Alliance. So the CLA, many of you I'm sure are familiar with the fact that CLA operates quite a bit differently from other what we call lake associations in their charter and in their mission and in their organizational structure and how they actually operate. It's a real honor to be able to partner with the CLA to try to understand how things operate in the watershed, and I think it's a really interesting component of it. I'm not going to talk about the land use change. I'm not going to talk about the economics. We're going to focus on what happens in Lake Mendota. By the way, this is a picture of the group from this research project representing about 5 different disciplines from 8 different universities, all who've come here to Lake Mendota to understand what's happening in Lake Mendota and the surrounding water. So I think that's it's a testament to what's happening here in Wisconsin and Madison, and the priority we all put on clean water and try to understand what's going on with clean water. I don't think I need to argue about the importance of the lakes to the Madison community. They're important for recreation, economies, fishing, sport, all kinds of different aspects. They're iconic, for Madison. It's why some people even moved to Madison in the first place, and it's what makes the Center for Limnology a great place to do research. And I'm sure all of you are aware, too, of the water quality problems that we have here at Lake Mendota. In fact, in all the lakes in the Yahara chain of lakes, and these problems are echoed all over the world. I think based on the introduction, it's pretty clear that most folks in the audience know that phosphorus is the culprit here, right? So loading of nutrients from the watershed into the lake leads to these kinds of conditions and degradation of water quality. Poor water clarity, loss of the macrophytes, a terrible smell in the water, and so on and so on, right? This will allow me, because I think you're all pretty well educated about phosphorus, but I do want to spend a few slides just to kind of go through a little bit of the history of the watershed to really give you the sense that these problems with phosphorus go back about 150 years. And that 150 years of accumulation of changes in the watershed are what we are now trying to reverse and trying to change ultimately the change in, or the water quality that we're experiencing in our lakes. So back in the 1830s, this is the first account, I think, that we have of water clarity in Lake Mendota, and probably the lake looked pretty pristine. Similar to the lakes that we see up north. But it didn't take long. It only took about 50 years before we have this account of what's happening on the lake by a botanist here at the University of Wisconsin. And just so you know, the culprit algae here, which is cyanobacteria or blue-green algae, are naturally occurring in water at different concentrations. So you find these things all over the world, in lakes all over the world. The problem is when the phosphorus concentration gets too high, these things are in such abundance that they exclude the other phytoplankton species and they lead to noxious conditions that we'll look at in a minute. And of course, it's due in part to this invasive species, the cow. Who doesn't love cows? You know, they're beautiful animals. They're really important to the economy, but they take a lot of management. And we've learned the hard way that you know, having a lot of agriculture in the watershed leads to consequences in our water quality for sure. Dick, this is from you right here. This is changes in agriculture. Let's bring it to pointer. There we go. Yeah, changes in agriculture in the watershed occurred or were complete more or less by 1900. And so, you know, we're going back more than 100 years of conditions that we have, you know, similar today, at least in terms of the amount of agriculture. The agricultural practice, of course, has changed quite a bit. And this has led to changes in water quality in the lake. You can see the dramatic shift in water quality earlier in the century to later in the century, and we're stuck up here. This is dissolved reactive phosphorus. Just think of it as phosphorus in concentration. I've drawn this blue line here to show that below the blue line our conditions are reasonably okay. We call it a mesotrophic system. Above the blue line, we're in a eutrophic state in which we have a lot of these algae blooms, we have a lot of water quality issues. What I think is interesting about this is that even though the agricultural changes began down here, you know, we're seeing the water quality shifts happen throughout the 20th century. And so that's a clue for you. That's a clue that there are a lot of, or there are long lags in the system. So we make a big change up in the catchment, and it takes decades and decades for that to play out in water quality change. And we're realizing that today in the changes we're trying to make in the catchment, hoping for changes in water quality that occur. And so it's summarized here in the diagram in a paper by Carpenter and others, where you know, the lakes are downstream of the rest of the catchment. Whatever we do up in the catchment ends up down in the lake and affecting the water quality of the lake. Okay? That's sort of lake and catchment 101. Now let's take a specific look at what happens in a lake like Lake Mendota when we add a lot of phosphorus to the system. And I just want to dive into a little bit of detail because it's important for some of the analysis I'm going to show you a little bit. So this is a depiction of a lake that has an atmosphere and a beautiful sun above it, so this means it's summertime. And in the summertime, the water warms up and the lake stratifies, which means that there's an upper layer of warm water, and beneath that is a layer of cold water. And if you've ever jumped into a lake, maybe it's a little bit smaller than Mendota, and you felt the warm water on top, and you dive down a little bit deep, and it gets cold down at the bottom, that tells you the lake is stratified. And that stratification means that this water up near the surface is separated from water that's further down. And this becomes important in the biology and the chemistry of the lake in a number of ways. So again, algae, and this is a zooplankton right here, it's a little animal that eats algae, are natural to all lake ecosystems. And when we're not in a eutrophic state, these things work in balance pretty well with each other so that the zooplankton here can feed off of the phytoplankton or algae and kind of keep the system in check. But when we add lots of phosphorus to the system, and it's a warm system, so it's summertime, algae begin to grow. And they grow really rapidly, and they overwhelm this poor guy's ability to consume them, and the algae take off, and we end up with this noxious surface scum ultimately, you know, that changes the quality of the system. And it leads to a bad smell, leads to toxic conditions where the water, in some cases, honestly, is not usable. It's not safe. And we see that in the warnings that we have on Lake Mendota throughout the summertime. But there are other consequences as well. So this algae that builds up in the surface of the water now sinks down into that lower layer. This upper layer, by the way, we call the epilimnion, and the lower is the hypo or hypolimnion. And of course, we have at the bottom of the lake the sediments, which are a key player in all of this. So that algae sinks down to the bottom. Algae fuels microbial respiration, so the bacteria down in the bottom of the lake eat that algae. They also eat other forms of carbon that come into the system. And this leads to a real problem, because when those algae, or when those bacteria consume that organic carbon, they eat up all the oxygen. Okay? When they consume all the oxygen, they turn that into carbon dioxide and methane. Both of those are powerful greenhouse gases. and nitrous oxide as well. But one of the unfortunate consequences is when we lose all the oxygen, fish like the Cisco, and some of you have been around long enough, I think, to remember that there used to be an abundance of Cisco, which is a cold water species in this lake. We still have a few left, but not very many. But fish like the Cisco die because they will select temperature over the availability of oxygen. They just have to have that cool temperature. So they'll go down there, they'll die, and Lake Mendota that we see today is different than Lake Mendota from a century ago. It supports a different community of fish. Okay? So that's a negative consequence for sure. And then another consequence is that when we lose the oxygen, we also promote release of phosphorus from the sediments and back up into the water column. So we have this sort of double whammy that's happening. We've got phosphorus coming in from the watershed, and we have phosphorus that's coming out of storage from the sediments up into the water column. And that creates an environment in which we can grow a lot of algae from year to year. So it's often sort of depicted this way: fish against cows, right? And I think this is a perspective that's not particularly nuanced today. This is, I think, how we kind of first thought about it. We can have one or the other, but we can't have both. But clearly, our culture and our economy, and just I think our desires for what we want in our watershed mean that we have to figure out ways to have both of these. Okay, so now what? We've learned a little bit about where the phosphorus comes from, what the water quality issues are. Those top two questions are questions that we addressed within this larger project I talked about. I want to go down to the bottom, though, and look at altered nutrient delivery and changes in water quality. And we understand that based on knowledge about the system and models in the system. So if we plot phosphorus data from our two different points in the lake, that upper epilymnitic layer and the lower hypolymnitic layer, this is what it looks like. That's pretty complicated. It's all over the place. Every year it's cycling back and forth. It kind of looks like there are long-term changes in the system. By the way, almost all of this is up in the eutrophic state for the system. The units on the bottom for hypolymnitic phosphorus are a lot higher than they are at the top. So the concentrations down here, are 5 to maybe 10-fold of what's happening up there. So the trick is trying to figure out what's happened in the last 20 years. Use that to improve our understanding of the way the world works. Once we understand the way the world works, now we can look forward in time and try to understand how changes in the catchment might affect water quality changes. How are we going to do that? We're going to use budgets. So this is an adaptation of a Morgridge quote that I thought was pretty poignant. He was talking about money, not phosphorus budgets, but we're going to use money as an analogy to learn about how we deal with phosphorus. So this should look familiar to you all. It's unfortunately very familiar to me, which is we're trying to maximize how much money we have in our checking and savings account, right? Seems pretty fair. And we know how to do that by increasing the income and decreasing the spending, right? Bring in more money. We're going to raise what's in the checking account and probably what's in the savings account. If we draw a lot out of the checking account and pay extra bills or have extra expenditures, we're probably going to pull from the savings. If we slow down this side, the spending side, we're probably going to move money from checking down into the savings account, and we can use it for a rainy day down the road. In sort of modeling science parlance, we call two components of these things data and model. So if you can observe something, we usually call it data. So you can see what's in your savings account, your checking account, you can see what you spend and what your income is. And all the arrows are the rules for moving money around in the system. That's what we call the model. And we put the model together with the data to understand how we can change the flow of money and the accumulation of money within a budget. We can emphasize checking, we can emphasize savings, we can emphasize spending. We can try to alter the income part of the system. This happens to be very similar to what we do with the lake and phosphorus. So convert dollars to phosphorus. We have input of, instead of money, phosphorus into the system. Some of it goes into long-term savings, which is the sediment. Some of it stays up in the water column, which is a sort of active, think of it as the checking account component of the system. Whoa. Some of it goes out the other end, flows down into Lake Mendota and further down through the Yahara River. And then in this upper part, the water column is very dynamic as things come and go through time. Unlike money, what we're really trying to do is instead of accumulate phosphorus in the system, we're trying to get rid of phosphorus in the system. Okay? Unfortunately, this is what it looks like when we actually go out and look at the system. It's very disturbing to look at, right? It's hard to understand what the data look like. It's hard to understand what the arrows look like. Ecosystems are very complicated. People get involved. The weather changes. There's hydrology. All these moving components to the system makes budgeting phosphorus a challenge because we have incomplete information, we have incomplete knowledge, but we do the best that we can by bringing those two things together. And so here's just a little bit more elegant depiction of that budget with phosphorus in the equation. There's phosphorus in the uplimnian, the hypolimnian. We bring it in from the catchment, we store some of it in sediments, and we export 30% of what comes in. This is actually really bad news. If this were money, this would be great, right? So you bring in your income and you're spending only 30% of it, that's fantastic. Your bank accounts are going up fast. Unfortunately, that's not what we want for phosphorus. We want to get rid of the phosphorus in the system. So we can either send it down into the sediments, so for a permanent burial, hopefully, if we can get rid of it, or we want to flush it out down the system. Or, over the long term, we need to decrease that load to the system, or we're not going to be able to fix it. Lake Mendota, by the way, is sort of up in this range of phosphorus in the upland, micrograms of phosphorus per liter. And oligotrophic systems, sort of clear water systems that you can see up north, for example, are of course much bigger than that. And so I'd shown you a picture before where phosphorus goes up and down throughout the year. Let's take a real quick look at how that happens through one annual cycle. So I've zoomed in to just a few years, and up on top, we're showing phosphorus in the uplimnian, and down on the bottom, phosphorus in the hypolimnian. And our first step is what happens in the winter. The units are different here, but if you were to look very closely at the graph, you'd see the concentration in the lower and the upper part of the water is the same. That's because the lake is mixed. We call this a dimictic lake because it mixes twice per year, once in the fall and once in the spring. And at the end of summer, when we have this fall mixes, those concentrations of phosphorus in the entire lake go up, and we're at our highest level throughout the year. In the springtime, we have this decrease in phosphorus that happens as algae grow in the system. They take up some of the phosphorus and they sink out of the upper layer of the water and back down toward the sediments. That continues. By the way, that doesn't happen every spring. Okay? If you were to look at the data, you'd see it happens maybe half to 2/3 of the time. In the summertime, we have lots of algae growing. Those algae take the phosphorus out of the upper part of the lake, send it down to the bottom where the microbes are, and we begin this vicious cycle of consuming all the oxygen and killing anything that's down on the bottom. In the fall, we mix the lake again, and boom, we pop right back up to the upper surface. Okay? So we have this sort of repetitious series in which we're really high in the winter. This is in the upper part of the water column. Really high in phosphorus in the winter and really low in the summer. And so from these ideas and from these data, what we're really interested in trying to figure out are kind of two big things. One is, can we figure out how to lower that summertime concentration of phosphorus? Because that's when the algae are growing those. And number two, can we change that long-term trend in the system? Can we slowly lower phosphorus over time? Okay? By the way, we just looked at the annual cycle. Here's the long-term data again. In addition to what's happening every year, we of course see these smaller changes, or not smaller, but more like maybe every 5 to 10 year cycles that are in the system. This makes our analysis complicated. Also, if you squint your eyes, you're wondering, gosh, maybe the trend is downward, and maybe we also see this change here that's happening in 2010. So we'll take a look at a couple of those things. So now our job is to use our phosphorus budget, along with the data, to try to understand what happens at an annual scale and what's happening over the long-term trend of the system. Okay? So that's basically what I just said. How are we going to get out of this conundrum? We need to understand the system better. We need to make sure we use those data to the extent that are possible. By the way, there's a Phanoxaminin balloon on Lake Mendota from, I think it was about 2014. Happened to occur when we had the open house at the Center for Limnology. One of our citizens took this picture. It's a beautiful blue, right? But I don't even want to step in it, let alone actually be in the water at that time. Okay? So putting our knowledge to work. So process models, physics, chemistry, and biology, that's what makes this challenging from a limnological perspective is we have to tie all of those pieces together. I'm going to skip over what's happening in the watershed and we're going to focus on the lake, but I do want to mention that our colleagues from Penn State do three-dimensional modeling of what's happening in the watershed. And so we have, for the first time ever, a 38-year water budget for Lake Mendota. And we're trying to work toward publication with this budget. It's surprisingly difficult to figure out where all the water is coming from and where it's going in the lake. So we use that water budget along with our knowledge of lake physics to recreate the physical conditions for the lake. I just want to show you a quick slide to make one point here, which is that the people who do lake physical limnology have done a really great job in trying to understand how physics work and have constrained it pretty well. They might argue that there's still a lot of work to do, and there is, if you're a physical limnologist, but from an ecologist perspective, this is really amazing. We can really fit the temperature data, which are shown up here. The dots are the observations, the model is the line, and we can fit the ice data pretty well. So that's just an example to show you. We think we know the physics pretty well. It's the chemistry and the biology that's really challenging for us. I'm not going to dive into this, but I thought I'd throw it up here for those of you who like mathematics, and just to remind myself to tell you that we really have a series of, these are called differential equations, that represent those arrows. You know, how does stuff move through the system, okay? And the set of equations essentially tells us that we have inputs, we have cycling that goes from the sediments up to the water column, and sedimentation that goes from the water column back down to the sediments. And those things are competing with each other, up and down throughout the water column, and we have outflow from the system. This also tells you that things like lake physics are important, so we have stratification in the system, temperature is important to the system. We're trying to account for not everything, but just those things that we feel are really important. We call this actually our simple model, and it is relatively simple compared to very complex numerical simulations of biogeochemistry in the system. All right? So how does it work? We take meteorological inputs, including rainbows, and the hydrological load that comes from the catchment and the lake physics, and we produce the time series that you see over here of phosphorus in the surface and phosphorus down below. And now what we need to do is find out, are our predictions matching the observations? If they are, great. If we're missing some components, then we need to kind of go back to the drawing board. And here's our set of predictions. So the model is dark and the observed is red. So you can see that we're reproducing on an annual basis. By the way, this is surface water phosphorus. We're reproducing that annual signal pretty well. In other words, it's going up in the winter, coming down in the summertime. But you know, if you look at this diagram long enough, you see we're missing a lot, right? We're missing some of the high highs in the wintertime. In 2010, it looks like we don't really capture the big change. Maybe we get a little bit of that that happened in 2010, but not all of it. Perhaps more importantly, if you look down here, this is the error that's in the model. We go from being under-predicting the system to over-predicting the system. In other words, over the long term, we miss the trend, which tells us that probably something we don't know that's happening in the system, and we're going to investigate that right now. Okay? What I had just shown you was sort of that annual cycle, but I think it's actually even more helpful to aggregate the data so you're looking at just the summertime phosphorus and just the wintertime phosphorus. We care a lot about what's happening in those two times of the year, especially in the summertime when we're trying to use the water. So on the left, we have the mean winter values across the roughly 20-year time series. It's a little hard to tell, I guess, but this is the model, that's the observed data. Over here, that's the observed data, here's the model, okay? And I don't think we're doing that well, right? We got the average, okay, that's the easiest thing to get, right? We got a little bit of the blips and the bumps. We've got this big one here just before 2010. We got a little bit of the dip after 2010. But if you were to look pretty closely at this, and if you look at the error, you find out we're under-predicting here, we're over-predicting down there, which means for the summertime, we missed the long-term trend. Plus, we also missed a lot of the important changes that are in the system. What that tells us is that our knowledge of the system and how we put that in our models is just incomplete. All right? We're missing something. We're not getting it right. And ditto for winter. Winter's a problem. Okay, so this is when we turn to our computer science colleagues. These happen to be folks at the University of Minnesota. They were investigating a new area of research, which is called theory-guided data science. I don't know if I put that up there, but I didn't. So they use the techniques that Google has used to do language translation, where they dig deep into the data using what's called deep learning. It's really just what are called recurrent neural networks. And they find the pattern that are deep in the data, and they use that to translate languages from English to pick your favorite language, other language. And it works great. But there are a lot of data in the corpus of human languages, trillions and trillions of examples of data. When I tell our computer scientist colleagues about the amount of data we have, they kind of laugh and say, it'll fit on our cell phone. That's not a lot of data. Right? And so we need to help out the machine learning a little bit with this new technique. So this is a conceptual diagram of how we deal with science and how we model. And I just want to talk about this for a second because it points to the new technique that we're working with our computer scientists on. Often we think of a theory versus data approach. So down here in the bottom is the use of data. If we don't use very much data, we're down here. If we use a lot of data, we're up here. Data science, machine learning, deep learning, all of that is way over on this axis over here on the right. It requires a lot of data, but they're very, very powerful techniques. The problem is, if you build your models on data, you're constrained to the data. Let's say the rules of the world change. Your model is built on data, the rules of the world change, your model's going to predict incorrectly. This is one of the issues that underlying the crash in 2008. The financial models were based on data, they weren't based on theory. Okay? On this other axis, we have use of scientific theory. That's what we're all about, trying to figure out the way the world works. And our most complicated models are way up here in numerical simulations. We put every process we can think of in there, the physics, the chemistry, the biology, stratification, all kinds of different things in the system. And we find out we make our models way too complicated. Turns out there's a nice compromise to the system, and that's being right in the middle. We can use our relatively simple models to train the neural network, so the neural network doesn't need as much data. Now the neural network is free to use our leftover data to help us understand what did we miss with our simple model, and how might we change our simple model to do a better job of prediction. I'm going to skip this. This just says we used a neural network. Okay. Here's the results. If you want to go back, we go back. Here's the results. So again, observed in red, and now you see our predictions are a lot more jittery because the neural network is better at picking up short-term variation. I will show you a direct comparison of the two different approaches here in a minute. If you can remember back a bunch of slides, our error is a little bit low. We still have a couple of problems that we didn't solve previously, and I'll come back to that in a minute. It's really hard to interpret, this, long-term time series in the data. So let's go back to, we're going to go back to looking at winter and summer in a second. Just let me explain one thing. What the neural network did is it went through, it used our model, and it said, let's try to make a prediction with your model. And it said, you know what, your model didn't do that well, so we think you should change your model. It reparameterized it. And at the same time, it said, you need to add a couple of things. One is you need to add a long-term trend based on almost certainly changes of phosphorus loads to the system. So this is good news. What it's saying is phosphorus loads have been going down over the decades. That's what the neural network is telling us. We need to go back, inspect the data, and think about how we're modeling the phosphorus loads to the system. It's also telling us that we're missing part of our model that deals with annual temperature changes. We have some of that in there, but there needs to be more of that in there. And it's also telling us one more thing, which is in 2010, something happened. It's not in the model. It's not in the data. We don't know what it is, so we need to go out and investigate what's happening there. Okay, so here are the results looking at winter and summer. Now what I'm going to try to do is sort of a live animation. I'm going to flip between this and the old result. and we'll kind of go back and forth. So you can see how the new modeling approach that uses the machine learning with our simple model differs from just the simple model approach. Hopefully it works for that. So there we go. Okay. Let's, for now, just focus on winter in the upper left corner. So that's new, old, new, old, new. Okay. Very nice. So in the new approach, we're doing a much better job getting the trend. In fact, we've quantified the trend, and we actually do capture the trend. Again, we don't know for sure what the process is. We know it's related to load in the system. We also are less biased in our model. These errors are bouncing back and forth between positive and negative a little bit better than they did in the old version. And the magnitude is also smaller. So if you look at those errors in the lower left, we're doing better. Okay. Now let's look at summertime. We can focus on a couple of sort of events that we captured pretty well during the summertime, but also the long-term trends. So just keep your eye on that. We'll pop back and forth a couple of times. No trend, trend, no trend, trend. Okay. We're also getting some of the bigger peaks and valleys a little bit better than we did in the past. And if you look down at the error on the bottom, you see the error is much more acceptable. Okay. So we've learned something here. And we'll come back to this in a second. We learned something here, which is that our simple approach to understanding the system captured a lot of the variability. We got it from year to year. We've got that annual dynamic pretty well. That means we understand how stratification works in the system. We understand how phosphorus moves from higher in the water column to lower in the water column. We understand pretty well how we release phosphorus from the sediments and how that is balanced by the phosphorus that's coming in from the catchment. What we didn't do very well in our original understanding of the system is understand what the long-term changes of phosphorus are in the system. I think our simple model just couldn't capture that long-term dynamic. We didn't have anything that was in there. Plus, we have to go back and look at the data a little bit more carefully. By data, I mean this inflow phosphorus concentrations and make sure we're mapping those changes in the inflow concentrations, which appear to be going down, to what's happening in the lake and in real model space. And then we need to just tweak a couple of things that have to do with the internal process of the system. So we think that's a pretty big victory for us as scientists, because not only did we have some success with our knowledge of the system, but we used our machine learning techniques and knowledge from our colleagues and computer scientists to inform us about what we don't know and what we might want to change in the system. Here's just sort of overall results on the budget in the system. Now I want to throw caveats up for the next couple of slides, all right? Please don't anybody quote me on these numbers. Let's not have them show up in the newspaper somewhere yet, okay? We're in peer review on this, and our peers may come back and have some criticism about what we're doing. So this is not released yet in publication, and the next slide is not either. When our peers come back and recommend that we make some changes to the system, it's possible that these numbers will change a little bit, okay? So again, a lot of phosphorus coming into the system. Not much of that gets exported. Most of it ends up down here in the sediments. Okay? What we're very concerned about and trying to figure out, but it's really challenging, is how much of that phosphorus is in an active layer of sediments down on the bottom that can recycle, and how much of that phosphorus is permanently buried, and the lake will no longer have access to it. In fact, that question is what motivated this part of the project in general, because we had no model to try to understand what would happen over a century of change in phosphorus at Lake Mendota, because we had no model that combined the sediments with the water column with the catchment in terms of a budget for phosphorus. We have that model now, and we hope we have a better understanding of what's going on down here. Also, I want to make this point that even though a lot of the phosphorus comes in from the catchment, the phosphorus that comes out of the sediments that's in storage in the lake is a really important component of the amount of phosphorus that's in the water column over here. What this tells you is that even if we turn off or lower phosphorus coming in from the catchment, it's going to take a while before we see really big changes that are happening in the water column phosphorus and the water quality that results, because we have a lot of storage that's happening down here. How do we cap that storage? How do we send it down further so we don't have access to it? We have to essentially add sediments to the system, and we don't want to do that because sediments bring with them phosphorus. So it's a bit of a conundrum. We don't know how to bury the phosphorus. We have chemical means for burying the phosphorus, right? But it's a really big lake, and there are lots of issues with engineered responses, right? But in the way the world works today, without manipulation of the system, we don't really know how we're going to bury that phosphorus. So what that really means is we're going to have to flush it out, okay? In practice, what's going to happen? We're going to try to reduce the nutrient load. We are trying to reduce the nutrient loads. We're probably going to reduce the sediment load to the system, which means we're going to have a slower permanent burial. And over the course of time, we'll have slow permanent burial, but we'll also have flushing from the system, and we'll see a slow change in phosphorus over the decades to come. Right, we've modeled that, and here are the results. Let's say, I should have picked 50, James, but I picked 70% reduction. I should have picked 50. Next time I'm going to pick 50% reduction.
Reallocating that as we speak.
Okay. I picked 70% change because I thought using the historical data from 95 to 2015, I could get us down to about a mesotrophic level using the current model that's in the system. So if we instantaneously knock down by 70% the load to the system, we see an immediate improvement in water quality. And then based on this interplay between that storage and the sediments, what's still coming in and what's being flushed out, it takes, what, a little over 2 decades to get us down to a mesotrophic level of water quality during the summertime. I think that's actually really great news. The hardest part of this is that sustained 70% reduction in the load for a lot of different reasons. You know, we can change agricultural practices, we can change the use of the landscape, but there's a lot of phosphorus up there. Let's go back to your wallet, my wallet. There's a lot of money out there, right? A lot of money. I don't have access to much of it. But if I wanted to increase the amount of money I had, and if I could gain access to all that money that was out there, it would change rapidly. In phosphorus terms, there's a lot of phosphorus out there on the landscape right now. So even if we stop the inputs from agriculture, there's still a big pool of phosphorus that's slowly leaching into the system. That's why this reduction of 70% is really challenging. Okay, so to sum things up from today, our understanding evolved. So the lessons that we learned a decade ago are being updated by what we're learning today. It takes models, it takes data. There is no substitute for long-term observations of the system. The world is constantly changing. We're never in a steady state. So we have to continually observe the world. The longer we observe the world, the more we learn about different scales at which things change. The longer we observe the world, the better our understanding of long-term changes in the system become. And then we have the data to be able to try to map our understanding models onto the world and check it against the data and use the data to develop it. So our understanding is always evolving. Don't let this year fool you, right? So I think this is one of the big lessons we've tried to communicate in climate change, for example, which is that there's a lot of year-to-year variability. And, you know, maybe we'll have a cold summer. That doesn't mean that the globe isn't warming, right? Okay. So things change a lot from year to year, and so this year may be an exception to what happens over the long term. And for Lake Mendota water quality, we have learned a lot about year-to-year variability. I think we're getting much better at trying to describe what that looks like, and we might actually be pretty good at forecasting what will be happening this coming summer, for example, with the caveat that we need to be able to forecast the weather too. So we all know how difficult that is. But given a particular weather scenario, I think we're in a position now where we can start to forecast water quality. And that's really big news. There are a lot of efforts on this front. The long-term change is going to have to be due to the loads. There's no way to change it other than to change what's down on the bottom or change what's coming in. That's going to determine the long-term change in the system. But we can do it, and I think we're already showing that it's begun. There's 150 years of legacy out there in the soil that we need to confront, we need to deal with. But I think efforts by the CLA and by concerned citizens and those in agriculture and industry in the watershed who really, care about what's going on out there in all of its dimensions, water quality, economies, our culture, I think are making some serious progress on this issue. And I'm optimistic over the course of the next couple of decades. So thanks for listening to the story about phosphorus and Lake Mendota. And if we have a little bit of time, I'll take some questions. And there's a lot of expertise, actually, in the audience, too. So if I get a stumper, Dick, I'm going to be pointing at you.
You mentioned increasing the flushing rate out of Mendota, which would help. Is there a way to increase the flushing rate without just dumping it into the other lakes? Or what happens to that flushing?
Spoken from somebody down in Lake Mendota, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I went to a meeting on water quality, maybe sponsored by the CLAs, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, talking about water quality in the Yahara Lakes. And you know what everybody talked about? Not water quality, but water quantity. And it was issues of flooding, that are happening in the system. So I'm not sure I have a good answer for you, but here are a couple of thoughts about it. If we decrease the hydrologic residence time, in other words, we push more water through the system, we will flush what's in there more quickly. One of the problems is that to increase hydrologic residence times means faster, more water coming in. And as a rule, when you increase the speed of water, you increase the amount of sediment that comes with it. So the lake begins to look a little bit more like, the faster you go, it looks more like the streams that feed it. We know that the lake retains 70% of what comes in, right? So by increasing the flow rate, would just look more like the Yahara River, which would actually be a decrease, probably a decrease in water quality, only because those two things tend to go together. So higher flow, higher loads, higher flow, more flooding. So management of water quantity is not an area I'm an expert on, but I do recognize that it's really a primary concern, I think, people live on the lake.
We have a question over here, and then please raise your hand as you see me looking around if you have a question, and I'll try to get the mic to you.
Thanks for a great lecture. But has anyone studied the possibility of using heavy equipment to remove the muck from the bottom of the lake and then make a pipeline to bypass the lakes and go to the Nine Springs area? How costly that would be?
I honestly have no idea. Perhaps there's somebody in the room, who's aware of that sort of study. So I don't know. On a conceptual basis, I think, let's say, hypothetically, we were able to control the loads to the system. That might, and I'm not sure economically if it's a viable solution, but in terms of an engineering solution, you just removed a lot of the phosphorus. Now, here's a little bit of an issue. You know how deep those sediments are in Lake Mendota? They're really deep. We went out with sonar mapping to try to look at how deep the sediments were. And in a lot of cases, we couldn't get all the way down to the bottom. So I don't know, Dick, do you know, are they 30 meters in some areas? Not 30 meters.
When you get down to the marl layer, you got about
A meter of active sediment.
Well, not active, but
Okay.
nutrient-rich sediment.
Nutrient, okay. Yeah, so if you took a meter of nutrient-rich sediment,
It's 60% of the deeper area of the lake.
okay, and multiplied that by the area of the lake, I guess it would give you the volume that you'd have to remove. But if we didn't control the phosphorus input to the system, we'd be back at square one. Yes.
Towards the end, you talked about a 70% reduction model, predictive model. Does that 70%, is it based on 70% reduction of incoming from the catchment, or does that also refer to the sediments, phosphorus coming out of the sediment?
It refers only to what's flowing in through surface water. Yeah, that's right. And We did that for a couple of reasons. One was because I tried a number of different levels and it brought us down to that mesotrophic level. But also it's really easy to manipulate the data that way. You know, we just take our inflow data and cut it by 70%. So it's a really easy experiment for us to run.
So you talked about the sediments in the lake, but the county is removing some of the sediments in the tributaries in their Suck Them Up program. How do you see those inputs as impacting the phosphorus in the lakes?
Right. Short answer is I don't know because I haven't had the chance to look at that. But I think, you know, in terms of what's happening in the catchment and the phosphorus budget of the system, I think it's knowable. You know, sediment moves downhill and it will pool in areas where the water slows down or changes flow rate or changes direction. And therefore we end up with a lot of sediment in the bottom of our rivers and streams. For the Yahara, in our total water budget of the system, I can't give you a firm number, but as you could imagine, probably 80 to 90% of the water is coming in through the major tributaries. There's a surprising amount of overland flow, and depends on the situation, sometimes groundwater input, sometimes groundwater output from the system. But if 70 to 80% of the water is coming through those tributaries, and those tributaries are places where sediment from the catchment is accumulating, and they are, we know this, they are a phosphorus source for the system. I can't quantify it because I haven't looked at it, but I think it'd be a really interesting analysis to do, for sure.
One of the areas that they have dredged in the past, so they have taken sediment out, is the stuff that comes out of Cherokee Marsh and flows through the Yahara past Skipper Buds, which houses a lot of people who use the lake, and Mazinet Marina, which houses a lot of people who use the lake, most of whom recognize that at various points in the summer you get stuck in the muck, quite literally. So if you remove the muck at the beginning of the chain, rather than trying to get 80 feet down to the meter of sediment that's in the middle of the lake, would that slow the phosphorus flow into the lake and thereby kind of improve the lake quality at the beginning, not the total beginning of the chain, but earlier in the chain than waiting until it hits the middle of the lake?
Well, it's a really interesting question, and I can only speculate. Okay, but we know when we move sediment through the system that it's going to stop and settle out in key places. One of them is in the tributaries of the system. Others settling ponds that are built up in the catchment, and others are at the mouths of the river, just like you're pointing out. And anyone, as you say, who's boated up there, I mean, you just look around, if you can see, you know, the bottom, depends on the time of year. You know how shallow that is up there, and there is a lot of sediment. To my knowledge, but Dick, you might know the answer to this. To my knowledge, no one's kind of looked at the phosphorus accumulation along that gradient from the mouth out. But Dick, do you have another perspective on this?
Well, we're doing a lot of work.
We're doing a lot of work on a rehabilitation plan for the whole Cherokee Marsh system, and the idea is to keep the sediment from moving through the system because it's very dynamic. Sediment comes in and then gets flushed out. I think the area you're talking about is by Skipper Buds and down that area. So that sediment is coming out of the Yahara system. So we're actually in the middle. Dane County's taking the lead on it. I'm involved with the project with some other people, trying to stabilize the sediments up in the system and prevent the marshland shoreline erosion.
Okay, great.
Last question, Paul.
We have one more question.
Thank you. So more of a hypothetical, and a lot of the analysis you showed is very interesting and historic, looking at historic data. So I'm the general public, and I'm going to ask, I hear stories about Yahara Pride farms, and they're enrolling thousands upon thousands of acres, over 90% of the farms in nutrient management. There's huge reductions there. Madison Med is doing huge reductions. The cities are doing huge reductions. Dane County is doing huge reductions on the land as well as suck them up. Long-term data, depending on who you're listening to, deep hole long-term data, if you go to the DNR public webpage, shows a long-term decrease in phosphorus in Lake Mendota. There's other sources out there that show a decline in phosphorus. We've seen articles in the news that say there's no change in phosphorus in the lake. We've seen articles in the news that says farmers aren't doing anything, they're not doing enough, the lakes will never heal, and some of those are coming from UW. As the general public and then to Clean Lakes Alliance, that's a big challenge. Because if, you know, I work for the DNR, full disclosure, but I get this question asked a lot, I'm a project manager. Can we do any good? There's a lot of conflicting information out there, which is true, which is right. We don't know who to believe. Do we have faith that these programs that we're working on with farmers, with Madison, with the cities, that they're actually doing any good? Because we see conflicting data and conflicting stories in the media. So how do we, as a lake community, try and come together and clarify that message so that the general public understands things better? Because it's really confusing, and I get these questions every day.
Mm-hmm. So I get similar questions, and I too am confused. So I think what you're referring to, and correct me if I'm wrong, is this notion that BMPs, or best management practices, don't really make a very big difference. And so in other words, if you change physical configuration, where you put manure, how you change the flow of water through the system, riparian zone changes, all these kind of management practices, other than let's say the input of phosphorus to the system, those don't seem to have an effect. And probably that's true just because the mass of phosphorus that's out there, it doesn't matter too much how you route the water through the system, except for this splashiness issue in moving sediments. You're going to leach a lot of phosphorus. On the other hand, it is a phosphorus budgeting issue. And so reducing the amount of phosphorus will eventually have an outcome. So I know that's a pretty soft answer to your question. And I think, from my perspective, now from somebody who studies the lake, and I don't know the details of what's happening in the catchment and sort of that area of the science, as well as many others, quite frankly. But I think the only solution to try to improve our understanding and to communicate those outcomes is to work in forums that are like this, quite frankly, where we bring together different stakeholders from the DNR, from the DW, from industry, from private citizens, to try to highlight these issues just as you've done, and try to understand, why are we talking about best management practices not working? Why are we talking about phosphorus budgets being the way to go? Why are we talking about sometimes we see change and sometimes we don't? So again, my apologies that I can't give you a firmer answer, but I do think it's really a social phenomenon as well as a scientific.
Thank you, Paul. So on the topic that Mark was talking about, how do you deal with conflicting messages? One of the things that the Yahara Clean Compact will address is public messaging, and so that we can work on how we all communicate loading and reductions and how we do that, so that we all can start working together on that. A couple quick updates here from Adam. First of all, this Saturday, Loop the Lake will be out there. I hope a lot of you will be joining us. If you don't want to bike, you can always volunteer. We need people in the Broad area, and I know you all know how to pour a beer. So join us this Saturday. If you'd like to sign up, you can go to our website or just reach out to us by phone. Also coming up, we've got a great event called Wapisa Surf and Turf, and so if you like to play golf or if you like to fish, it's a contest going on coming up on July 11th. You can sign up for that. And next month's Yahara Lake 101, which is July 24th, is the health impacts of pollutants in the Watershed, being presented by UW-Madison School of Medicine and Public Health. Thank you again, and go out there and enjoy the lakes this weekend.